The fountain shot water 30 feet into the air, its rainbow lights flashing in perfect rhythm with the music blasting from hidden speakers. Karen's face turned bright red as she stood in her white business suit, now completely soaked from head to toe. The entire HOA board meeting had stopped to stare at my masterpiece through the community center windows. "Turn it off," Karen screamed, her perfectly styled hair dripping wet and her makeup running down her cheeks like black tears. "Turn it off right now." But I just smiled and pressed another button on my remote control. The fountain's lights switched from rainbow to a bright, pulsing red that lit up the entire street. The music got louder. Bach's Water music echoed through the neighborhood like a victory song. "Sorry, Karen," I called out sweetly. "It's within the legal operating hours according to Section 4.2 of the HOA handbook. You know, the same handbook you used to fine me for watering my roses." The look on her face was worth every penny I'd spent on this beautiful, monstrous fountain. But let me tell you how we got here, because this story starts 3 months earlier, when I was just a regular single dad trying to keep his plants alive. It was a sunny Tuesday morning in March when I first met Karen Williams, president of the Sunset Meadows Homeowners Association. I was outside my new house, wearing my favorite old t-shirt and shorts, gently watering my front yard roses with a simple garden hose. The morning sun felt warm on my back, and I was humming quietly to myself, thinking about how lucky I was to finally have a place where my 8-year-old daughter Emma could run around safely. I'd been living in Sunset Meadows for exactly 2 weeks. The neighborhood was perfect, quiet streets, friendly neighbors, and great schools. After my divorce, I'd used all my savings to buy this little 2-story house with the white picket fence. It wasn't much, but it was ours. Emma loved the big backyard, and I loved the peaceful feeling of finally having a real home. The roses in my front yard were my pride and joy. The previous owner had planted them years ago, but they'd been neglected. I'd spent every free moment since moving in trying to bring them back to life. There were red ones, pink ones, and beautiful white ones that reminded me of my grandmother's garden. Emma helped me every evening after school, carefully measuring out plant food and learning the names of each variety. "Daddy, the white ones are called Snow Queens," she'd said the night before, her little hands dirty from helping me plant new mulch. "And the red ones are Fire Dragons." I made up that name. I smiled, remembering her excitement. These roses weren't just plants to me. They were a symbol of our new beginning, a sign that we could take something broken and make it beautiful again. That's why I was so surprised when a shadow fell across my garden, and a sharp voice said, "Excuse me." I looked up to see a woman in her 50s standing on my sidewalk. She was wearing a crisp white blouse, perfectly pressed navy pants, and shoes so shiny they could blind someone. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and she was holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. "Are you the new owner?" she asked, but her tone made it sound more like an accusation than a question. "Yes, I'm Marcus Johnson," I said, turning off the hose and wiping my hands on my shirt. "Just moved in a couple weeks ago. I'm Karen Williams, president of the Sunset Meadows Homeowners Association." She said it like she was announcing herself as the Queen of England. "I need to speak with you about your activities." I looked around, confused. "My activities? Your watering schedule is in violation of HOA regulations." She flipped through pages on her clipboard with the efficiency of a lawyer preparing for trial. According to Section 3.7 of the Community Guidelines, lawn and garden watering is only permitted between the hours of 6 a.m. and 8 a.m., and again between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. I checked my watch. It was 9:15 a.m. "I'm sorry, I didn't know," I said honestly. "I haven't gotten my copy of the HOA handbook yet. I was just trying to save my roses before it gets too hot." Karen's eyes narrowed like I just told her I was planning to paint my house neon green. "Ignorance of the rules is not an excuse, Mr. Johnson. Every homeowner receives a copy of the regulations with their welcome packet." "I never got a welcome packet," I said, starting to feel a little frustrated. And nobody told me about watering rules when I bought the house. That's impossible, Karen snapped. I personally oversee all new resident communications. But I knew what I had and hadn't received. The only thing in my mailbox for the past 2 weeks had been bills, junk mail, and a sweet note from my neighbor Mrs. Chun welcoming me to the neighborhood with a plate of homemade cookies. Look, I said, trying to keep my voice calm and friendly. I'm sorry I didn't know about the rule. I'll make sure to water during the right hours from now on. These roses just need a little extra care right now because they're in pretty bad shape. Karen looked at my roses like they were personally offending her. The state of your landscaping is another concern. Dead or dying plants reflect poorly on the entire community's property values. My temper started to rise. These roses weren't dead. They were recovering. Anyone with eyes could see the new growth, the fresh green leaves, the tiny buds that were just starting to form. I'd been working so hard to bring them back to life. They're not dying, I said a little more firmly. They're actually doing really well. Look, you can see new growth here and… Mr. Johnson, Karen interrupted. I don't have time for a gardening lesson. You were watering outside of permitted hours. That's a violation. She pulled out a small booklet from her clipboard and started writing. I'm issuing you a formal warning. Any future violations will result in a fine. She tore off a yellow carbon copy and handed it to me. At the top, in bold letters, it said, Homeowners Association Violation Notice. I stared at the paper, hardly believing what I was reading. A warning for watering my plants? This had to be a joke. This seems a little extreme for a first offense, I said, especially since I didn't even know about the rule. Karen's smile was as cold as ice water. Mr. Johnson, rules exist for a reason. They maintain order, protect property values, and ensure that Sunset Meadows remains a desirable place to live. When people start thinking they can just ignore the rules, the entire community suffers. I'm not trying to ignore anything, I said, my voice getting louder despite my efforts to stay calm. I just didn't know. Well, now you do. Karen clicked her pen and put it back in her shirt pocket. I trust this won't happen again. She turned to leave, but then stopped and looked back at me. Oh, and Mr. Johnson? That t-shirt you're wearing is also inappropriate for front yard activities. Section 2.3 clearly states that residents should maintain appropriate attire when visible from the street. Tank tops, shirts with holes, or excessively casual clothing can negatively impact the neighborhood's appearance. I looked down at my shirt. It was just a regular blue t-shirt, maybe a little faded, with a small hole near the hem that Emma had patched with a little heart-shaped piece of fabric. It was comfortable and practical for yard work. Are you serious? I asked. Completely serious. I suggest you review the handbook carefully, Mr. Johnson. I'd hate for you to accumulate multiple violations so early in your residency. And with that, Karen Williams walked away, her heels clicking on the sidewalk like a countdown timer. I stood there for a long moment, holding the violation notice and feeling like I'd just been hit by a truck. This wasn't the peaceful, friendly neighborhood I'd thought I was moving into. This was something else entirely. That evening, Emma came running into the house after school, her backpack flying behind her and her face bright with excitement. Daddy, can we water the roses now? I want to see if the fire dragons have any new buds. I looked at the kitchen clock. It was 4:30 p.m., still too early for the approved watering hours. We have to wait until 6 o'clock. Sweetheart, I said, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. Why? Emma asked, tilting her head the way she did when she was trying to understand something that didn't make sense. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that there's a woman in the neighborhood who thinks she can control when people water their plants? How do you tell your daughter that the simple joy of taking care of something together has to be scheduled around someone else's rules? There are some new rules I have to follow, I said carefully. We can only water the plants at certain times. Emma's face fell. But what if the plants get thirsty before 6 o'clock? That's a very good question, honey. That night, after Emma had gone to bed, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and tried to find this mysterious HOA handbook. I searched through every box from the move, every piece of paper the real estate agent had given me, every document in my filing cabinet. Nothing. Finally, I called my real estate agent, Janet Martinez. She'd been so helpful during the buying process, and I figured she'd know about the HOA rules. Marcus, how are you settling in? Janet's voice was warm and friendly, a nice change from Karen's ice-cold tone. Pretty well, except I'm having some trouble with the HOA, I said. Apparently there's a handbook with rules about watering plants, and I never got a copy. There was a pause on the other end of the line. That's odd, Janet said slowly. I specifically remember putting the HOA packet in your closing documents. Let me check my records. I heard papers rustling in the background. Here it is, Janet said. I have a receipt showing that Karen Williams signed for the new resident packet on March 3rd. She was supposed to deliver it to you within 48 hours of your move-in date. March 3rd was 3 days before I moved in. Today was March 17th. She never gave me anything, I said. Well, that's a problem, Janet said, and I could hear the concern in her voice. You can't be expected to follow rules you've never seen. Let me email you a copy of the handbook right now, and I'll give Karen a call tomorrow to find out what happened. Thanks, Janet. I really appreciate it. Of course. And Marcus, be careful with Karen Williams. She's intense. Some of the other agents in my office have had issues with her before. Just document everything. Okay? After we hung up, I opened my laptop and waited for Janet's email. When it arrived, I clicked on the attachment and started reading the Sunset Meadows Homeowners Association Community Guidelines and Regulations. It was 47 pages long. 47 pages of rules about everything from garbage can placement to mailbox design to the exact shade of white that was acceptable for front doors. There were regulations about dog leashes, garden gnomes, holiday decorations, and yes, watering schedules. But as I read through the document, I noticed something interesting. The rules were very specific, but they were also full of loopholes if you knew how to read them carefully. For example, Section 3.7 said that sprinkler systems and handheld watering devices were restricted to certain hours. But it didn't say anything about automatic irrigation systems or decorative water features. Section 2.3 talked about appropriate attire, but defined it so vaguely that it could mean almost anything. And Section 4.2 was particularly interesting. It dealt with decorative water features and had very specific rules about fountains, ponds, and other water installations. But unlike the watering restrictions, these rules were much more flexible. As long as a water feature followed certain guidelines about size, noise levels, and operating hours, it was perfectly legal. I was starting to get an idea. The next morning, I made sure to water my roses at exactly 6 a.m. I wore my nicest khaki pants and a button-down shirt, even though I was just going to get dirty working in the garden. I followed every rule in Karen's handbook to the letter. At 6:15 a.m., right on schedule, Karen Williams appeared on my sidewalk. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson," she said, but her tone suggested it was anything but good. "Good morning, Mrs. Williams," I replied cheerfully. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" She looked me up and down, clearly searching for something to criticize. My clothes were appropriate, my watering was happening during approved hours, and my roses were looking better every day. "I see you received the handbook," she said finally. "Yes, my real estate agent emailed it to me yesterday evening. Very thorough document. I'm curious, though, didn't you sign for my new resident packet 2 weeks ago?" Karen's face went slightly pink. There must have been a mix-up in the office." I said, not taking my eyes off her. "Well, I'm sure these things happen." But I could see in her eyes that there had been no mix-up. She'd deliberately not given me the handbook, hoping I'd rack up violations without knowing the rules. It was a setup from the very beginning. "Your roses are looking better," Karen admitted reluctantly. "Thank you. Emma and I have been working really hard on them. Did you know that these varieties are actually quite rare? The white ones are snow queens, and they're particularly valuable." I made up the part about them being rare and valuable, but Karen didn't need to know that. "Well," Karen said, clearly uncomfortable, Just make sure you continue following the regulations. Oh, I will, I said with a smile. I'm actually planning to do some more landscaping improvements soon. Maybe add a water feature or two. Karen's eyes narrowed. Any modifications to your property must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee. Of course, I said. I'll be sure to submit all the proper paperwork. After she left, I stood in my front yard for a long time, thinking. Karen Williams had tried to trick me into breaking rules I didn't know existed. She'd set me up to fail from day one. But now I knew exactly what I was dealing with. That evening, Emma and I watered the roses together during the approved hours. She chattered excitedly about her day at school while I thought about water features and architectural review committees. Daddy, what's that smile for? Emma asked, noticing my expression. Oh, nothing, sweetheart. Just thinking about some improvements we might make to our garden. Can we get a bird bath? My friend Sophia has one, and it's so pretty. Maybe something even better than a bird bath, Emma. Maybe something really special. As we worked together in the peaceful evening light, I started making plans. Karen Williams wanted to play games with rules and regulations. Fine. I'd read every single page of that handbook, and I'd follow every rule perfectly. But I had a feeling that Karen was about to learn that two could play at this game. The next morning, I woke up early and drove to the city planning office. I needed to understand exactly what I could and couldn't do with my property. The clerk, a friendly woman named Susan, was incredibly helpful. So you want to install a decorative water feature? She asked, pulling up my property information on her computer. Yes, and I want to make sure I follow all the rules perfectly. Well, let's see. Your property is zoned residential and you're part of the Sunset Meadows HOA. That means you'll need to follow both city regulations and HOA guidelines. She printed out several pages of information. For the city, as long as your water feature is under 8 feet tall and doesn't create noise above 55 decibels, you just need a simple permit. The HOA rules might be more strict. I have a copy of the HOA handbook, I said, pulling it out of my bag. Susan and I spent the next hour going through the regulations together. She helped me understand the legal language and pointed out several important details I'd missed. This is interesting, she said, pointing to section 4.2. It says that water features are allowed as long as they operate between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m., don't exceed 60 decibels, and are aesthetically pleasing and appropriate for the neighborhood character. What does aesthetically pleasing mean exactly? That's pretty subjective, Susan said. It usually means it has to look nice and fit in with the neighborhood. But who decides what's nice is often up for interpretation. And there's no limit on size? Not according to this. Just the height restriction from the city and the noise limits. I left the planning office with a pile of paperwork and a growing sense of excitement. That afternoon, I called 3 different fountain companies to get quotes. The first company was too expensive. The second company was too small scale for what I had in mind. But the third company, Aqua Design Specialists, was perfect. So you want a fountain that's impressive but follows all the HOA rules? Asked Rick, the owner of Aqua Design. I love customers who know exactly what they want. It needs to be big enough to make a statement, but legal enough that they can't touch it. Rick grinned. Oh, I have just the thing. Let me show you some designs. For the next 2 hours, Rick and I planned my fountain. It would be 6 feet tall, under the city limit, with multiple tiers and LED lighting. It would have a sound system that could play music at exactly 59 decibels, under the HOA limit. And it would be absolutely, undeniably beautiful. The best part, Rick said, is that it's completely automatic. You can control everything from your phone, the lights, the music, the water pressure, even the height of the spray. How much? For everything you want, installed and ready to go?
$12,000.
I gulped. That was a lot of money. But I thought about Karen's face when she'd handed me that violation notice. I thought about how she'd deliberately withheld the handbook to set me up for failure. I thought about Emma asking why the plants couldn't have water when they were thirsty. When can you start? I'll need to get the city permit first, then submit the plans to your HOA for approval. If everything goes smoothly, we could have it installed in about 6 weeks. Perfect. That night, I carefully filled out the HOA architectural review application. I included detailed blueprints, material specifications, and noise level certifications. I cited every relevant section of the handbook and explained exactly how my fountain would comply with each rule. I hand-delivered the application to the HOA office the next morning at exactly 9 a.m. when they opened. The secretary, a nice older woman named Mrs. Patterson, looked over the paperwork with interest. "My, this is quite detailed," she said. "Most people just submit a simple drawing." "I want to make sure everything is done correctly," I said. "Well, the Architectural Review Committee meets next Tuesday. You should get an answer within 2 weeks." As I walked back to my car, I noticed Karen's white SUV pulling into the parking lot. She got out, saw me, and immediately walked over. "Mr. Johnson, what brings you to the HOA office?" "Just submitting an application for a home improvement project." "What kind of project?" "A water feature for my front yard." Karen's eyes lit up like she'd just won the lottery. "A water feature? That's quite an undertaking. I hope you've done your research on the regulations." "Oh, I have. Very thoroughly." "Well, I'm sure the Architectural Review Committee will give it all the consideration it deserves." There was something in her tone that made me suspicious. Karen Williams was far too happy about my fountain application. That afternoon, I got a call from Janet, my real estate agent. "Marcus, I have some news about Karen Williams that you might want to know." "What kind of news?" "I did some digging after our conversation yesterday. Karen has been the HOA president for 8 years, and let's just say she's not very popular with the other residents." "What do you mean?" "There have been complaints. Lots of them. She's been accused of playing favorites, harassing residents she doesn't like, and interpreting the rules in ways that benefit her friends and hurt her enemies." "Has anyone done anything about it?" "A few people have tried to challenge her, but she's very good at using the rules to shut them down. She knows that handbook inside and out, and she's not afraid to use it as a weapon." "What about the Architectural Review Committee? Are they fair?" Janet was quiet for a moment. "Marcus, Karen is the Architectural Review Committee. She has 2 other members, but they're basically her puppets. She controls every decision." My heart sank. I'd submitted my carefully prepared application to the very person who'd been trying to make my life miserable from day one. "So she's going to reject my fountain application?" "Almost certainly. And she'll probably find a way to make it look like it's your fault." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at my copy of the HOA handbook. I'd been so careful, so thorough. I'd followed every rule, crossed every T, dotted every I. But none of that mattered if Karen could just reject my application for no reason. Unless I started reading the handbook again, but this time I wasn't looking for rules about fountains. I was looking for rules about the Architectural Review Committee itself. And there, buried in section 8.4, I found something very interesting. The Architectural Review Committee was required to respond to all applications within 14 business days. If they failed to respond within that time frame, the application was automatically approved. More importantly, any rejection had to include specific reasons citing exact sections of the handbook. Generic rejections or rejections without proper citations were invalid. And there was one more thing. If a resident felt that the Architectural Review Committee had acted unfairly or violated their own procedures, they could appeal to the full HOA board. The board met once a month, and their meetings were open to all residents. I checked the calendar. The next board meeting was in 3 weeks. I was starting to get a new plan. Karen Williams thought she held all the cards, but she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd given me a copy of the handbook, and I'd actually read it. All of it. Over the next few days, I prepared for war. I made copies of every document, photographed every page of the handbook, and researched every legal precedent I could find about HOA disputes. I also did something else. I started talking to my neighbors. Mrs. Chun, the sweet older woman who'd brought me cookies, had plenty of stories about Karen Williams. She made us remove our beautiful rose trellis, Mrs. Chun said sadly. Said it was visually intrusive. But her friend Mrs. Murphy has one twice as big, and Karen never says anything about it. Tom Rodriguez, who lived 2 houses down, had his own Karen story. She fined me 3 times for parking my work truck in my own driveway, Tom said. Said it was commercial vehicle parking, even though I'm a plumber and I need my truck for my job. But somehow her nephew's landscaping business can park their huge trailer on the street every weekend. One by one, I discovered that almost every resident in Sunset Meadows had a Karen Williams horror story. She'd been bullying and harassing people for years, and everyone was too afraid or too tired to fight back. But here's what Karen didn't know. I wasn't afraid of her. I was angry, and I was about to turn her own rules against her in a way she'd never seen coming. Exactly 2 weeks after I submitted my application, I got a letter in the mail from the Architectural Review Committee. It was a rejection, just as Janet had predicted. But when I read the letter, I smiled for the first time in days. Karen had made a mistake. A big one. The rejection letter was only 2 sentences long. Your application for a decorative water feature has been denied. The proposed installation does not meet community standards. That was it. No specific rules cited.
No detail de explanations.
No references to the handbook sections that supposedly supported the rejection. According to Section 8.4 of the handbook, this rejection was completely invalid. I had her. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at 7 p.m. in the community center. I spent the entire day preparing my presentation, organizing my documents, and practicing my speech. When Thursday arrived, I put on my best suit and drove to the community center. The meeting room was small, with about 30 chairs arranged in rows facing a long table at the front. Karen sat in the center chair, flanked by 4 other board members. About 15 residents were scattered throughout the room, looking bored and slightly annoyed to be there. "Good evening, everyone," Karen said, calling the meeting to order. "We have several items on tonight's agenda, including budget discussions and upcoming community events." She went through the usual business quickly, clearly wanting to get through the meeting as fast as possible. Finally, she reached the end of her agenda. "Is there any new business?" she asked, already starting to gather her papers. I stood up. "Yes. I'd like to appeal the Architectural Review Committee's decision regarding my water feature application." Karen's head snapped up, and for just a moment, I saw panic flash across her face. Then she quickly composed herself. "Mr. Johnson, appeals must be submitted in writing at least 48 hours before the meeting." "I did submit it in writing," I said calmly, pulling out a receipt. "I delivered it to the HOA office on Tuesday at 2 p.m. Mrs. Patterson signed for it." Karen looked at the other board members, then back at me. I don't recall seeing any appeal. "Perhaps you should check with Mrs. Patterson," I suggested. "I'm sure she'll remember." One of the other board members, a middle-aged man named David, leaned over to whisper something to Karen. She nodded reluctantly. "Very well," Karen said. "You may present your appeal." I walked to the front of the room and turned to face the small audience. This was it. Everything I'd been planning for the past 2 weeks came down to the next few minutes. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, 3 weeks ago, I submitted a detailed application for a decorative water feature to be installed in my front yard. I spent considerable time and effort ensuring that my proposal complied with every single rule in the HOA handbook. I held up my copy of the handbook and the original application. My application included detailed blueprints, material specifications, noise level certifications, and specific citations to every relevant section of the handbook. I followed every procedure exactly as written. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her chair. 2 weeks later, I received a rejection letter from the Architectural Review Committee. However, This rejection letter violated the committee's own procedures in several significant ways. I pulled out the rejection letter and read it aloud. Your application for a decorative water feature has been denied. The proposed installation does not meet community standards. That's the entire rejection. 2 sentences. I looked directly at Karen. According to Section 8.4 of the handbook, any rejection must include specific reasons citing exact sections of the handbook. This rejection cites no rules, no sections, and no specific reasons. Therefore, according to the handbook, this rejection is invalid. Karen's face was starting to turn red. Mr. Johnson, the committee has broad discretion to determine what meets community standards. Actually, no, it doesn't, I said, flipping to the relevant page in the handbook. Section 8.4 is very clear. Discretion must be exercised within the framework of the written rules. The committee cannot simply reject applications based on subjective opinions without citing specific violations. I turned back to the audience. But there's more. I've reviewed my application against every single rule in the handbook, and I can demonstrate that my proposed fountain complies with all of them. For the next 10 minutes, I went through my fountain specifications point by point, showing exactly how each element followed the rules. Height restrictions, noise limits, operating hours, materials, installation procedures, everything was perfectly legal. Furthermore, I continued, I've discovered that several other residents have been allowed to install similar features without any problems. Mrs. Murphy has a fountain in her backyard that's actually larger than what I'm proposing. The Hendersons have a decorative pond with a waterfall. The Johnsons on Maple Street have a fountain with colored lights. I'd done my homework. I'd walked through the entire neighborhood taking photos of every water feature I could find. So the question is, I said, looking directly at Karen, why is my fountain being rejected when similar features have been approved for other residents? Karen's face was now bright red. Those installations were approved under different circumstances. What circumstances? I don't have to explain the committee's decision-making process to you, Karen snapped. Actually, you do, I said calmly. Section 8.4 requires that all committee decisions be explained in writing with specific rule citations. Since your rejection letter provides no such explanation, I'm formally requesting that you either provide a proper rejection with specific citations or approve my application. The room was completely silent. Even the other board members were staring at Karen, waiting to see what she would do. Mr. Johnson, Karen said, her voice tight with anger. Your fountain is too large, too elaborate, and completely inappropriate for a residential neighborhood. Too large according to which rule? I asked. The city allows structures up to 8 feet tall, and mine is only 6 feet. The handbook has no height restrictions for water features. Too elaborate according to which rule? The handbook says features must be aesthetically pleasing, and I have photos showing that my design is similar to features already approved in this neighborhood. And inappropriate according to which rule? Section 4.2 specifically allows decorative water features as long as they meet noise and operating hour requirements, which mine does. Karen looked like she was about to explode. I don't have to justify every decision to you. According to the handbook, yes, you do. The room erupted in murmurs. Several residents were nodding in agreement. Tom Rodriguez actually started clapping. David, the board member who'd whispered to Karen earlier, cleared his throat. Karen, I think Mr. Johnson has a point. The rejection letter is pretty vague. David, don't. I move that we vote to approve Mr. Johnson's application, David said suddenly. I second that motion, said another board member. Karen looked around the table in shock. You can't do that. I'm the president of this board and the chair of the Architectural Review Committee. And we're voting members of this board, David said firmly. All in favor of approving Mr. Johnson's water feature application? 3 hands went up immediately. Karen stared at them in disbelief. All opposed. Only Karen raised her hand. The motion passes, David announced. Mr. Johnson, your fountain is approved. The room broke into applause. Several residents came up to shake my hand and congratulate me. Mrs. Chun actually hugged me. But as I packed up my papers and prepared to leave, I noticed Karen watching me with a look of pure hatred. She wasn't done with me, not by a long shot, and I realized that getting my fountain approved was only the beginning of this war. As I walked out of the community center that night, I felt a mixture of victory and apprehension. I'd won the battle, but I had a feeling that Karen Williams was already planning her next move. What I didn't know was that she was about to make the mistake that would change everything. The mistake that would lead to the day when she'd stand soaking wet in her white business suit, screaming at me to turn off my magnificent, perfectly legal fountain while the entire neighborhood watched and laughed. But first, she had to try to destroy me. The first fine arrived exactly 1 week after the board meeting. It was waiting in my mailbox when I got home from work, nestled between a pizza coupon and my electric bill like a snake hiding in tall grass. Violation notice, second offense. The amount at the bottom made my heart skip a beat. $200. Emma found me standing in the driveway, staring at the yellow paper with my mouth hanging open. "Daddy, what's wrong?" she asked, dropping her backpack and running over to me. "Nothing, sweetheart," I said, quickly folding the notice and putting it in my pocket. Just some boring mail. But it wasn't boring. It was war. According to the violation notice, I had been watering plants outside of approved hours on Tuesday morning at 8:47 a.m. The fine was for $200, and it warned that any future violations would result in even higher penalties. The problem was, I hadn't watered anything on Tuesday morning. I'd been at work by 8 a.m., sitting in my office cubicle, drinking coffee and reviewing sales reports. I had witnesses. I had a badge scan showing exactly when I'd entered the building. Karen Williams had just made her first big mistake. That evening, after Emma went to bed, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and started building a case. I pulled up my work schedule, my badge scan records, and even the security camera footage from my office building. I had solid proof that I was nowhere near my house at 8:47 a.m. on Tuesday. But I also did something else. I set up a security camera in my front window, pointing directly at my garden. If Karen was going to make false accusations, I was going to be ready for her. The next morning, I drove to the HOA office to dispute the fine. Mrs. Patterson, the secretary, looked genuinely upset when I showed her the violation notice. "Oh my," she said, adjusting her glasses. "That's a very serious fine. Are you sure you want to dispute it?" "I'm absolutely sure," I said. "I wasn't even home when this supposed violation occurred." "Well, you'll need to fill out a dispute form and provide evidence. The dispute will be reviewed by—" She paused and looked uncomfortable. "By Mrs. Williams." "The same Mrs. Williams who issued the violation?" "Yes, I'm afraid so. She handles all enforcement matters." I filled out the dispute form and attached copies of my work records. I knew Karen would reject it, but I wanted everything documented. 3 days later, I got Karen's response. The dispute was denied. According to her letter, photographic evidence clearly shows watering activity at the reported time, but she didn't include any photographs. I immediately requested copies of this photographic evidence under the HOA's transparency policy. Karen's response was swift and predictable. Evidence is only available to HOA board members and cannot be shared with residents. That was her second mistake. According to Section 7.3 of the handbook, residents had the right to review any evidence used against them in violation proceedings. Karen was making up rules as she went along. But things were about to get much worse. The second fine arrived on Friday. This one was for $300, claiming I had failed to maintain appropriate landscaping standards. The specific violation, dead plant material visible from street. I laughed out loud when I read it. My roses were more beautiful than they'd ever been. I'd been taking daily photos of them to document their progress, and they were absolutely thriving. Bright green leaves, healthy new growth, and several buds that were about to bloom. The third fine arrived on Monday. Another $300 for inappropriate front yard activity. The description was so vague it was almost comical. Resident engaged in activities not suitable for neighborhood standards. I'd been outside for exactly 10 minutes that morning, checking my mailbox and deadheading a few spent blooms. Inappropriate clothing during appropriate hours, doing exactly what any homeowner would do. By Tuesday, I'd received $800 in fines for violations I hadn't committed, with evidence that didn't exist, using rules that Karen was making up on the spot. That's when I realized what she was really doing. Karen wasn't trying to enforce HOA rules. She was trying to force me to move. She was hitting me with so many fines so quickly that I'd either have to pay thousands of dollars or sell my house and leave the neighborhood. But Karen had seriously underestimated who she was dealing with. That evening, I called an emergency meeting with my neighbors. Not an official HOA meeting, just a gathering of residents who were tired of Karen's bullying. Tom Rodriguez came over first, followed by Mrs. Chun, then David Martinez and his wife Sarah. Even quiet Mr. Peterson from the corner house showed up. By 7 p.m., I had 12 neighbors sitting in my living room, all with their own Karen Williams horror stories. "She's fined me 6 times this year," said David. $300 each time. "For things like having my garbage can out 15 minutes too early. She made me remove my children's swing set," said Sarah. "Said it was visually inappropriate. But her friend Mrs. Murphy has a hot tub right in her front yard. She's been trying to get me to move for 2 years," said Mr. Peterson quietly. "Ever since I complained about her dog barking all night." One by one, they shared their stories. Karen had been systematically harassing residents she didn't like, using the HOA rules as weapons to make their lives miserable. "The thing is," said Tom, "most people just pay the fines and keep quiet. It's easier than fighting her." "But what Marcus did at the board meeting," said Mrs. Chun, "that gave me hope. Maybe we can actually do something about her." "What do you have in mind?" I asked. "We need to document everything," said David. "Every violation, every fine, every time she treats residents differently. We need to build a case. And we need to get more people involved," added Sarah. "Karen has been getting away with this because she picks on people one at a time. But if we all stand together." We spent the next 2 hours planning our strategy. We would document every interaction with Karen, keep records of all violations and fines, and most importantly, we would support each other when she tried to bully us. But as everyone was leaving, Tom pulled me aside. "Marcus, you need to be careful," he said quietly. "Karen is vindictive. She's going to come after you harder than anyone else because you embarrassed her at the board meeting." "Let her come," I said. "I'm not backing down. I know you're not, but she's going to try to destroy you, and she's very good at it." Tom was right. The next morning, I woke up to find a certified letter in my mailbox. It was from the HOA's lawyer, informing me that I was being sued for $1,200 in unpaid fines, plus legal fees and interest. But the letter also contained something else. A notice that if I didn't pay the fines within 30 days, the HOA would begin foreclosure proceedings on my house. They were trying to take my home away from me. I sat in my car outside the post office, reading the letter over and over again. Emma was at school, and I was supposed to be at work, but I couldn't move. The legal language was intimidating and scary, full of words like lien and foreclosure and seizure of property. For the first time since this whole thing started, I felt truly afraid. That's when my phone rang. It was Janet, my real estate agent. "Marcus, I just heard about the lawsuit from a friend at the courthouse. Are you okay?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "They're trying to take my house, Janet, over fake violations and made-up fines." "Okay, listen to me carefully. Do not panic. This is exactly what Karen does to people she wants to get rid of. But here's what she doesn't know: you have rights. And I know someone who can help you." "Who?" "My brother-in-law is a lawyer who specializes in HOA disputes. His name is Mike Chun. Yes, he's married to your neighbor, Mrs. Chun. He's been waiting for someone to finally stand up to Karen Williams." An hour later, I was sitting in Mike Chen's office, surrounded by law books and case files. Mike was a small, quiet man with kind eyes and a gentle voice, But when he read Karen's lawsuit, his expression turned hard. "This is harassment," he said simply. "Pure and simple harassment. And it's also legally questionable." "What do you mean?" "Several things. First, they're claiming you owe money for violations that were never properly proven. Second, they're trying to foreclose on your house without following proper procedures. Third, they're using the threat of foreclosure to coerce you into paying disputed fines." Mike opened a thick file on his desk. "I've been collecting information about Karen Williams and the Sunset Meadows HOA for 3 years, waiting for the right case to challenge her. You might be exactly what I've been looking for." "What kind of information?" "Evidence of selective enforcement. Proof that she applies rules differently to different people. Documentation of harassment campaigns against residents she doesn't like. And most importantly, evidence that she's been exceeding her authority as HOA president." Mike showed me photograph after photograph of HOA violations that had been ignored. Mrs. Murphy's oversized fountain. The Hendersons' unpermitted deck addition. Dr. Smith's bright red mailbox that clearly violated the color guidelines. "All of these people are Karen's friends," Mike explained. "She's never fined any of them, even though their violations are much more serious than anything you've been accused of. So what do? We file a countersuit. We're going to sue Karen Williams and the HOA for harassment, selective enforcement, and violation of your due process rights." "How much will this cost?" Mike smiled. "Nothing. I'm going to do this pro bono. I've been wanting to take down Karen Williams for years. You're just giving me the perfect opportunity." That evening, I sat Emma down for a serious conversation. She was old enough to understand that something was wrong, and I didn't want her to be scared. "Sweetheart, you know how there are rules at school? And sometimes the rules are fair and sometimes they're not?" Emma nodded. "Like when Mrs. Patterson made Jake sit in the corner for talking, but she didn't make Sarah sit in the corner even though she was talking too." "Exactly like that. Well, there's a lady in our neighborhood who's been making unfair rules for Daddy, but I'm working with some lawyers to make sure the rules are fair for everyone." "Is she the mean lady who didn't like your t-shirt?" I was amazed at how much Emma remembered. "Yes, that's her." "Are we going to have to move away?"
No, sweetheart.
"We're not going anywhere. This is our home, and we're going to fight to keep it." Emma hugged me tight. "I don't want to leave the fire dragons." "We won't leave the fire dragons. I promise." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal activity. Mike filed our countersuit, and suddenly Karen found herself on the defensive. She hired her own lawyer, and the HOA meetings became tense, formal affairs with attorneys present. But Karen wasn't giving up. If anything, she was getting more aggressive. She started driving by my house multiple times per day, looking for violations. She measured the height of my grass with a ruler. She took photographs of my mailbox from every angle. She even brought out a decibel meter to measure the noise from my air conditioning unit. And then she made her biggest mistake yet. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and I was at work when my phone rang. It was Mrs. Chun, and she sounded panicked. "Marcus, you need to come home right now. Karen is at your house, and she's doing something to your garden." I left work immediately and drove home as fast as I could. When I turned onto my street, I saw Karen's white SUV parked in my driveway. Karen was standing in my front yard with a clipboard and a camera, photographing my roses. But she wasn't just photographing them. She was cutting them. I parked on the street and walked up to my yard, trying to stay calm. Karen looked up as I approached, and I could see guilt flash across her face before she composed herself. "Mrs. Williams," I said quietly, "what are you doing in my yard?" "I'm documenting safety violations," she said, holding up her clipboard. "These rose bushes are overgrown and pose a hazard to pedestrians." I looked at my roses. They were beautiful, healthy, and nowhere near the sidewalk. They posed no hazard to anyone. "You're on my private property without permission," I said. "I have the right to inspect for violations," Karen replied. "No, you don't. The HOA has no right to enter private property without the owner's consent." Karen's face turned red. "Don't lecture me about HOA rights, Mr. Johnson. I know these rules better than you ever will. Then you know that what you're doing is trespassing. I'm trying to protect this neighborhood from people like you, Karen snapped. People who think they can just ignore the rules and do whatever they want. What rules am I ignoring? Your roses are overgrown. According to which section of the handbook? Karen paused, clearly searching for an answer. Section 3.4. I pulled out my phone and opened the handbook app I downloaded. Section 3.4 deals with mailbox regulations. It has nothing to do with plants. Well, then Section 3.9. Section 3.9 is about garage door maintenance. Karen's face was getting redder by the minute. Look, I don't have time for this. Your roses are too big, and I'm documenting it. Mrs. Williams, I need you to leave my property right now. I'm not finished with my inspection. Yes, you are. We stood there staring at each other for a long moment. Karen was holding her camera in one hand and pruning shears in the other. Several of my rose stems were lying on the ground at her feet. You cut my roses, I said. I trimmed back dangerous growth. You destroyed my property. I was protecting the neighborhood. That's when I noticed something. Mrs. Chun was standing in her window holding her phone. She was recording the entire conversation. Tom Rodriguez was in his driveway also recording. David Martinez was walking his dog, but he'd stopped to watch, and his phone was out too. Karen had finally gone too far, and half the neighborhood was documenting it. Mrs. Williams, I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. You are trespassing on my property, you have damaged my plants without permission, and you are refusing to leave when asked. I'm calling the police. Karen's eyes went wide. You can't call the police on me. I'm the HOA president. Being HOA president doesn't give you the right to trespass and vandalize people's property. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. As I explained the situation to the dispatcher, Karen quickly gathered her things and headed for her car. This isn't over, Mr. Johnson, she called out as she drove away. This is far from over. The police arrived 20 minutes later. Officer Martinez, no relation to my neighbor David, was professional and thorough. He took photos of the damaged roses, interviewed the neighbors who had witnessed the confrontation, and filed a report. Mr. Johnson, he said as he finished up, I want you to know that being HOA president doesn't give someone the right to enter your property without permission. What she did today was trespassing and vandalism. Will you press charges? That's up to you. But I'd recommend documenting everything and talking to a lawyer. That evening, I called Mike Chun and told him what had happened. He was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Marcus, he said finally, I think Karen Williams just handed us the case we've been waiting for. What do you mean? Trespassing, vandalism, harassment, abuse of power. This is exactly what we need to prove, that she's been exceeding her authority and targeting you specifically. So what happens now? Now we go on the offensive. I'm going to file for an emergency restraining order against Karen Williams. And we're going to amend our lawsuit to include these new charges. But Mike, what about my fountain? All of this started because I wanted to install a fountain. Mike laughed. Oh, don't worry about your fountain. After what happened today, I have a feeling that fountain is going to be the least of Karen's problems. 2 days later, I got a call from Rick at Aqua Design Specialists. Marcus, I've got great news. The city permit came through, and your fountain is ready to install. When do you want to schedule it? I looked out my window at my damaged roses, already starting to recover and grow new shoots. I thought about Karen's face when she'd realized the whole neighborhood was watching her trespass and vandalize my property. How about tomorrow? I said. Tomorrow works for me. We'll have your fountain up and running by evening. That night, I sat on my front porch with Emma, watching the sunset and planning our fountain ceremony. Daddy, when the fountain is finished, can we have a party? Emma asked. That's a great idea, sweetheart. We'll invite all the neighbors. Even the mean lady? I smiled. Especially the mean lady, because I had a feeling that Karen Williams was about to get a very special invitation to see my fountain in action. And this time, she was going to get a lot more than she bargained for. The next morning, Rick and his crew arrived at 7 a.m. sharp. They worked all day, installing pipes, setting up the pump system, and carefully positioning the beautiful three-tiered fountain in the center of my front yard. By 5 p.m. it was finished. The fountain was even more beautiful than I'd imagined. 6 feet tall, with elegant curved tiers that caught the light perfectly. The LED system could create any color combination I wanted, and the sound system was nearly invisible but crystal clear. "Want to see the best part?" Rick asked, handing me a tablet. "You can control everything from this app. Water height, lighting, music, even preset shows for special occasions." I touched the screen and the fountain came to life. Water cascaded down from tier to tier, creating a gentle, soothing sound. The LED lights shifted from blue to green to gold, and soft classical music began playing. "It's perfect," I said. "And completely legal," Rick added with a grin. "Every specification follows the HOA rules exactly." That evening, I threw an impromptu fountain warming party. Mrs. Chun brought homemade cookies. Tom Rodriguez brought beer. David and Sarah Martinez brought their kids, who were fascinated by the colored lights. Even Mr. Peterson came out of his house to admire the fountain. "It's beautiful, Marcus," said Mrs. Chun, "and it's going to drive Karen absolutely crazy." "That's the idea," I said, raising my beer bottle in a toast. "To fighting back." "To fighting back," everyone echoed. But as we stood around my fountain, laughing and celebrating, I had no idea that Karen Williams was already planning her final, desperate move. The move that would lead to the most spectacular showdown our neighborhood had ever seen. The move that would finally expose her for what she really was, in front of the entire HOA board and half the neighborhood. And the move that would involve a very wet, very angry woman in a white business suit, screaming at me to turn off my perfectly legal fountain while the whole world watched. But that confrontation was still 2 weeks away. First, Karen had to make one last mistake. The mistake that would give me the opportunity I'd been waiting for. The mistake that would let me turn my fountain into the ultimate weapon of perfectly legal revenge. Karen's final mistake came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 2 weeks after my fountain was installed. I was getting ready for work when my phone rang. It was Mrs. Patterson from the HOA office, and she sounded terrified. "Mr. Johnson, I'm so sorry to bother you, but there's been an incident." "What kind of incident?" "Mrs. Williams has called an emergency HOA board meeting for tonight. She's claiming that your fountain is a public safety hazard and needs to be removed immediately." I looked out my window at my beautiful fountain, sparkling in the morning sun. It was operating perfectly, exactly as designed, following every single rule in the handbook. "On what grounds?" "She's saying it's causing flooding in the neighborhood and creating a dangerous situation for children." I almost laughed. My fountain used less water than a typical garden sprinkler, and it was completely contained within its own basin. There was no flooding, no danger, and certainly no threat to children. "Mrs. Patterson, has anyone else complained about flooding?" "Well, no. But Mrs. Williams says she has documentation." "What kind of documentation?" "Photos, I think, and some kind of water damage report." This was it. Karen was making her final desperate play, and she was about to destroy herself in the process. "What time is the meeting?" 7 o'clock. "Mr. Johnson, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but she's already prepared a removal order. She's planning to have your fountain taken out tomorrow morning." "We'll see about that," I said. After Mrs. Patterson hung up, I immediately called Mike Chun. He was in court, but his secretary said she'd have him call me back as soon as possible. Then I called Rick from Aqua Design Specialists. "Rick, I need you to do me a favor. Can you come over this afternoon and do a complete inspection of my fountain? I need official documentation that it's working perfectly." "Sure, no problem. Is there an issue?" "Karen Williams is making her final move, and I want to be ready for her." Next, I called Tom Rodriguez, Mrs. Chun, and David Martinez. Within an hour, our entire neighborhood resistance network was activated and ready for battle. But I also did something else. Something that would turn this emergency meeting into the most memorable night in Sunset Meadows history. I spent my lunch break at the electronics store, buying the most powerful remote control I could find. Then I went home and spent 2 hours programming new features into my fountain's control system. When I was finished, my fountain could do things that would make Karen Williams wish she'd never heard my name. That evening, I put on my best suit and walked to the community center. Emma was staying at Mrs. Chen's house for the night, safely away from what was about to happen. The meeting room was packed. Word had spread through the neighborhood that something big was going down, and it seemed like every resident in Sunset Meadows was there. Karen sat at the head table with the other board members, looking confident and smug. But I noticed something interesting. 2 of the board members who had voted with me at the last meeting, David and Mrs. Rodriguez, looked uncomfortable. They kept glancing at Karen and whispering to each other. "Good evening, everyone," Karen said, calling the meeting to order. "I've called this emergency meeting to address a serious safety concern that has come to my attention." She stood up and walked to the front of the room, holding a thick folder. 2 weeks ago, despite my strong objections, this board voted to approve a massive water feature installation by Mr. Marcus Johnson. I warned you all that this was a mistake, and unfortunately, my concerns have proven to be justified. Karen opened her folder and pulled out a stack of photographs. Over the past 2 weeks, Mr. Johnson's fountain has caused significant water damage to surrounding properties. The excessive water usage has created flooding in several yards, and the constant moisture has led to mold growth and structural damage. She held up a photo of what appeared to be a flooded basement. "This is Mrs. Murphy's basement, completely flooded due to runoff from Mr. Johnson's fountain." She showed another photo of a yard with standing water. "This is the Hendersons' backyard, turned into a swamp by the excessive water from this inappropriate installation." Karen looked directly at me as she spoke. "Furthermore, the fountain has created a dangerous situation for children. The slippery surfaces and electrical components pose a serious risk of injury." She held up what appeared to be an official-looking document. "I have here a safety inspection report from the city's water management department, recommending immediate removal of this hazardous installation." Karen sat down, looking triumphant. "Therefore, I am calling for an emergency vote to revoke Mr. Johnson's permit and require immediate removal of this fountain." The room erupted in murmurs. Several residents looked concerned. Karen's presentation had been professional and convincing, but I was smiling, because I knew something that Karen didn't know I knew. I stood up and walked to the front of the room. "Thank you, Mrs. Williams. That was a very impressive presentation. I have just one question." Karen looked annoyed. "What is it? How did you get into Mrs. Murphy's basement to take that photograph?" Karen's face went slightly pale. Mrs. Murphy gave me permission." "Mrs. Murphy," I called out, turning to face the audience, "did you give Mrs. Williams permission to enter your basement?" Mrs. Murphy, an elderly woman in her 70s, looked confused. "I don't know what you're talking about, dear. My basement has never been flooded." A ripple of whispers went through the crowd. I turned back to Karen. "And what about the Hendersons' backyard, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson? Did you give permission for Mrs. Williams to photograph your supposedly flooded yard?" Mr. Henderson stood up. "Our yard isn't flooded. I was out there this morning, and it's perfectly dry." The whispers were getting louder. I pulled out my phone and opened the photo app. "Ladies and gentlemen, I took these pictures this afternoon, just a few hours ago." I held up my phone so everyone could see. "This is Mrs. Murphy's house. As you can see, there's no standing water, no flooding, and no damage of any kind." I swiped to the next photo. "This is the Hendersons' backyard, completely dry with no signs of." "And this is my fountain, operating normally, with all water contained within its proper basin." The room was completely silent now. Everyone was staring at Karen, who looked like she'd seen a ghost. "Mrs. Williams," I said calmly, "where exactly did these photographs come from?" Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish. The water department gave them to me." "The water department?" Yes, they conducted an inspection and… Actually, I interrupted. I called the water department this afternoon. They have no record of any inspection of my fountain. They also have no record of any complaints about flooding in our neighborhood. I reached into my jacket and pulled out an official letter. This is a statement from the city's water management department, confirming that my fountain meets all municipal water usage guidelines and poses no flood risk to surrounding properties. Karen was starting to panic. Those photos are real. I took them myself. Where did you take them? In the neighborhood. Which neighborhood? Karen looked around the room desperately. This neighborhood. Right here. Mrs. Williams, I said, pulling out my laptop. I spent this afternoon doing some research. Would you like to know what I found? I opened my laptop and connected it to the room's projector. Karen's flood photographs appeared on the wall, blown up for everyone to see. I did a reverse image search on these photos. This first one, which you claim is Mrs. Murphy's flooded basement, is actually a stock photo from a water damage restoration company's website. Gasps filled the room. This second photo, which you claim is the Hendersons' flooded backyard, is from a news article about Hurricane Katrina. It was taken in New Orleans in 2005. The room exploded in shocked voices. Several people were pointing at Karen, who had gone completely white. And this document, I continued, holding up the fake safety report, is not from the city's water management department. It's a blank inspection form that you downloaded from the internet and filled out yourself. Karen stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous. I don't have to sit here and listen to these accusations. Actually, you do, said Mike Chun, standing up from the back of the room. Mrs. Williams, I'm Mike Chun, Mr. Johnson's attorney. What you've just presented to this board constitutes fraud, harassment, and defamation. Karen's eyes went wide. You can't prove anything. Actually, I can, Mike said, walking to the front of the room. I have documentation of your systematic harassment of my client, including the trespassing incident 2 weeks ago where you illegally entered his property and vandalized his plants. Mike opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. I also have evidence of selective enforcement, where you've ignored identical violations by your friends while aggressively pursuing my client for non-existent infractions. He handed a document to each board member. This is a restraining order issued by the county court this afternoon, prohibiting you from any further contact with my client or his property. Karen looked like she was about to faint. You can't do this to me. I'm the HOA president. Not anymore, said David, one of the board members. Karen, in light of what we've just learned, I'm calling for a vote of no confidence. I second that motion, said Mrs. Rodriguez. Karen looked around the table desperately. You can't vote me out. I've been president for 8 years. All in favor of removing Karen Williams as HOA president? David asked. Her hands went up immediately. Only Karen's hand stayed down. The motion passes. Mrs. Williams, you are no longer president of this board. Karen's face went from white to bright red. This is illegal. You can't do this to me. Actually, we can, said David. And we just did. But Karen wasn't finished. In her panic and rage, she was about to make the final mistake that would create the moment I'd been waiting for. Fine, she screamed. If you want to support that fountain, then I'll show you what I think of it. Karen stormed out of the community center, but instead of going to her car, she marched straight across the street toward my house. Everyone in the meeting room rushed to the windows to see what she was doing. Karen walked right up to my fountain and started kicking it. I'll show you what happens to people who mess with me, she yelled, loud enough for everyone to hear. That's when I pulled out my phone and opened the fountain control app. Mrs. Williams, I called out through the open window. I wouldn't do that if I were you. But Karen was beyond reasoning. She was in a complete rage, screaming and kicking at my fountain like it had personally offended her. Your stupid fountain is going to be gone tomorrow, she yelled. I don't care what anyone says. She grabbed the top tier of the fountain and tried to rock it back and forth. That's when I pressed the button labeled Emergency Defense Mode. I'd spent 2 hours that afternoon programming this special feature into my fountain's control system. It was designed to activate the maximum water pressure, the brightest lights, and the loudest music all at the same time. The fountain exploded to life. Water shot 30 feet into the air, directly over Karen's head. The LED lights flashed in brilliant rainbow patterns, strobing like a disco ball, and the hidden speakers began blasting Beethoven's Ode to Joy at maximum volume. Karen screamed as she was instantly soaked from head to toe. Her carefully styled hair was plastered to her head. Her white business suit was completely drenched, and her makeup was running down her face in black streaks. But the best part was that she was standing right in the center of the fountain spray pattern, and every time she tried to move away, the motion sensors I'd installed would adjust the water direction to follow her. "Turn it off," Karen screamed, spinning around in circles as the fountain tracked her movements. "Turn it off right now." But I was having too much fun. I pressed another button, and the fountain's lights changed to a pulsing red pattern, while the music switched to Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries. "Sorry, Karen," I called out sweetly. "It's within the legal operating hours according to Section 4.2 of the HOA handbook. You know, the same handbook you used to fine me for watering my roses." Karen tried to run, but she slipped on the wet pavement and fell right back into the fountain spray. The motion sensors immediately locked onto her again, and she was hit with another blast of water. The entire neighborhood had come out to watch. People were pointing and laughing. Someone was taking pictures. Mrs. Chun was actually clapping. "This is harassment," Karen screamed, still trapped in the fountain's spray pattern. "No," I said, finally pressing the button to turn off the water. "This is justice." Karen stood there for a moment, completely soaked and humiliated, looking around at all the neighbors who were watching and laughing. "This isn't over," she said, but her voice was weak and defeated. "Yes, it is," I replied. "It's completely over." Karen Williams walked slowly to her car, dripping wet and leaving a trail of water behind her. She got in, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. The neighborhood erupted in cheers and applause. I walked back into the community center, where the entire HOA board was waiting for me. "Mr. Johnson," said David, who was now the interim president, "I think we owe you an apology." "No apology necessary," I said. "Sometimes bullies need to be stood up to." "What's going to happen to Karen?" asked Mrs. Rodriguez. "She's going to face the consequences of her actions," said Mike Chin. "Fraud, harassment, trespassing, vandalism. She's going to be very busy with lawyers for a long time." That night, I sat on my front porch with Emma, watching my fountain cycle through its beautiful light patterns. "Daddy, why is the fountain so pretty?" Emma asked. "Because we fought for it, sweetheart. We didn't give up, even when someone tried to make us." "Are the fire dragons safe now?" I looked at my roses, thriving in the fountain's gentle mist. "Yes, honey, the fire dragons are safe. And so are we." 3 months later, Karen Williams moved out of Sunset Meadows. She sold her house quietly and left without saying goodbye to anyone. The new HOA president, David Martinez, was fair and reasonable. He focused on actual community improvements instead of harassing residents. And my fountain? It became the pride of the neighborhood. People would walk by just to see the light shows, and children would beg their parents to let them make wishes and toss coins into the water. Emma and I still water our roses every evening during the approved hours. But now we don't have to worry about someone with a clipboard and a bad attitude coming to ruin our peaceful moments. Sometimes, late at night, I'll sit by my fountain and remember the look on Karen's face when she realized she'd been caught in her own lies. The look of shock when she was voted out of office. And most of all, the look of complete and utter defeat when she stood there soaking wet, finally understanding that she'd met someone who wouldn't be bullied. My fountain still operates every day, exactly according to the HOA handbook. It's perfectly legal, perfectly beautiful, and perfectly satisfying. And every time I hear the water cascading down from tier to tier, I'm reminded of the most important lesson I learned from this whole experience. Sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to follow their own rules better than they do. Sometimes the best revenge is a fountain that works exactly as designed. And sometimes justice really does rain down from above.